as a Pan-African organization that tries to bridge the gap between international, continental, regional, and national level issues when it comes to debt, we have played a very important role in trying to bridge that entire spectrum of stakeholders and people that we engage in. So at the very outset, the main agenda for AFRODAD in the Fourth Financing for Development International Conference was to ensure that the Compromiso de Sevilla, which is the outcome document, was to have language and very strong progressive language that would determine and define reform of the global architecture and the global debt architecture more specifically. The journalists who are in this briefing are very familiar with some of the critique that AFRODAD has provided on the current debt restructuring process under the G20 Common Framework. We've also expressed doubts around some of the previous initiatives like the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative that was introduced during COVID-19. So the very big agenda that we had in this Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development was to get very strong language around reforming the debt architecture. And this language includes a legally binding intergovernmental process that would lead to the establishment of a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. Now, in very simple terms, what this means is that this convention would then become the blueprint of how debt restructuring, resolution of debt crises would be defined and governed under the auspices of the United Nations, because the current institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and other development financial institutions are just not fit for purpose in this regard. So this was the big ask, and the role we played in there is fourfold. At the international level, we were working very closely with the African group of African member states, also known as the African Group, in the United Nations, to support their negotiations and their negotiating tactics and strategy in ensuring that this language was introduced and retained in the final outcome document. The language itself was introduced during the first negotiating round in June 2024 by the Africa Group. At that time, it was read out by the representative from Burundi, who read it on behalf of the Africa Group. This meeting took place in Addis Ababa last year in June 2024 to kick off the process. At the continental level, we worked very closely with the African Union Commission in developing and supporting them in conceptualizing their African Union debt conference, which took place in May of this year, in 2025, in Lomé, Togo. And this conference gave rise to the outcome document called the Lomé Declaration. And within that, had this specific request and ask from the international community to have this UN Framework Convention established in the outcome document of the Compromiso. So at the continental level, our work was very much with the African Union Commission to ensure that they also had a concerted push, a political push, as well as a technical push on ensuring this kind of language continued to be part of the negotiations that were taking place in New York with the Africa Group there. At the regional level and national level, our work was to really concentrate and provide a narrative around the weaknesses of the current debt architecture, using examples such as Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, on how ineffective the common framework actually is and why there was need to have an alternative. Similarly, countries like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Malawi that have struggled with their debt positions more recently and having to take out more debt in order to pay current debt was just a further illustration at the national level that AFRODAD had to continue making the case for why it was important to reform the global debt architecture. So these are the four levels that AFRODAD had engaged in to try and make sure that our work was built up from the national level with case studies around the debt crisis and the debt situation in a number of African countries, the ineffectiveness of the G20 Common Framework in resolving the debt crisis for countries that have entered the common framework, building political consensus at the continental level with the African Union Commission in order to ensure that we
Peut-être
have a common
consensus au
position,
niveau
and then at the international
du
level, supporting the negotiating strategy and tactics with the Africa Group and the Alliance of Small Island States to ensure that we got some very strong language in there. The result, of course, in the
Gouvernement.
Compromiso de Sevilla is that we got some language around an intergovernmental process. We didn't get the full language on the establishment of a framework convention on sovereign debt, but we did get strong language on the creation of an intergovernmental process. And this is a very important step towards towards getting the UN Convention on Sovereign Debt. So this is the role we played. This is how we structured and strategized our way through the last 14 months in the FFD process.